Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to Endurance. If you remember, in the last episode we assembled our mighty interplanetary spacecraft to take Kerbalkind back to their original homeworld, well now completely desolate homeworld of Kerbin. And we actually have a name for the spacecraft now. I asked you guys, we had quite a few pretty good suggestions, but in the end I've gone for Odyssey for the main spacecraft because, you know, long journey home and all that. And the lander is going to be called Phoenix because it's going to be rising out of the ashes of our fallen homeworld back up to the Odyssey to retrieve the scientific data still stored in the archives back in the old Kerbal Space Center. Perhaps we can actually get some relics of the old space program and advance our technology that way. So that's the main objective of this mission. Head back to Kerbin, now called the Wasteland, of course, land at the old Kerbal Space Center and see what we can find. And of course we'll be visiting Malice, the moon made out of the collision between the original moon and Minmus, just in a low orbit around the Wasteland as well. You see there decoupling our first batch of fuel tanks, which does increase the amount of delta V we have by about a kilometer per second. Yeah, this spacecraft actually has way too much delta V. But after the fiasco, I don't want to say fiasco with Reclaimer. Reclaimer is stuck in orbit around Demise, but Reclaimer is producing 13 science a day. So that's about 500 science every 40 days or so. So throughout this episode, even though I don't show all of them on screen, I do keep swapping back to Reclaimer and transmitting its science. Because of course you've got a cap at 500, which I do find kind of irritating. There's a limit to how much data you can put in a science lab and how much science you can hold at any one time. It would be kind of nice to maybe after a certain amount of time in the game, like get researcher tech that just allows you to have a constant trickle of science income. There's got to be a mod for that, right? Yeah, because it's kind of awkward to have to keep micromanaging all the various different science labs we have all around the solar system. So to kind of ease that process, that would be greatly appreciated. But you see here, we have ourselves our encounter with the Wasteland, and we have a bit of a correction maneuver we're going to be doing a little later on. But here we are, swapping back to Reclaimer, as I said, transmitting our 500 science and then continuing our research in low orbit over Demise. And what we're going to do now that we have a spacecraft heading towards the Wasteland is pledge our space program to the Wasteland program, which increases our milestone returns for the space around the Wasteland, and it's also going to give us quite a big reward for planting a flag on the surface. Now, we have quite a few other things to tend to while Odyssey is heading out to the Wasteland. You might remember Memory 1. This is a spacecraft that's heading all the way out to Elu, now called Eltos. And it has another 2 years before it actually reaches there, but we have I don't want to say small, quite a hefty correction burn to make here. But this spacecraft has a lot of delta V. Yeah, I overbuilt a lot of my my spacecraft after I was kind of sick of them all running out of fuel. Now we have Kerbal Engineer, our spacecraft are going to be built with a slightly finer room for error, since we have pretty accurate delta V estimates. But as you see, we finished off our actually the upper stage of our launch vehicle there, and now we actually have the main spacecraft with its 3 nuclear engines, just finishing that burn, and we should arrive at Eltos in 2 years. When I launched this, I was worried that I might reach warp technology by the time this actually gets out there, but no, I think it's going to get out there well before we complete the tech tree. With the difficulty that we're playing on, even with the huge bounties of science that we're getting from our spacecraft across the system and our space stations, etc., it's still taking a long time to research all this stuff. You will see here, though, we're having a bit of trouble actually transmitting our science from Reclaimer because it's on the opposite side of the sun from Solitude. However, what we can do is bounce the signal from Memory 1 back to Solitude. Not a particularly efficient way of doing things, but it works well enough, and we managed to transmit our 500 science and continue our research around Demise. So swapping back to Odyssey, we have a bit of science to transmit from it as well, but it's not producing anywhere near as much as Reclaimer. But it is now time for a very small correction burn to bring our periapsis up above the Wasteland's atmosphere and bring us into an orbit of around 80 kilometers in altitude. I think the atmosphere is about 50 kilometers in altitude. Quite a lot of it's been stripped away by Archangel. Now what we're trying to do here is burn off the remaining fuel in these external tanks and then decouple them so that they'll crash into the wasteland's atmosphere and then perform a tiny little extra burn just to raise that periapsis so that the main spacecraft doesn't follow suit. So as you see here, just waiting until it's out of fuel, then swapping our focus over to the wasteland so that we can see how low our periapsis is. And then what we're going to do is just making sure it's still inside the atmosphere. We're going to decouple those two side fuel tanks. Now they're out of fuel, and they will then crash into the wasteland. We haven't been religious about keeping space debris down, but you know, it helps to do it now and then when it's convenient. So, before Odyssey actually arrives at the wasteland, we have our transfer window to Demise opening up. And of course, we need to send our resupply mission to resupply Reclaimer with supplies and fuel so that it can actually return back to Solitude with its bounty of science. It's certainly benefited us quite a bit, actually having Reclaimer stay in orbit around Demise. But I think it's time we actually send a spacecraft. There's only so long they can actually stay there before the Kerbal start going stir crazy, so we need to bring them home eventually. So we're going to send a pretty big spacecraft. As you see, we're launching another one of our 110 ton the top of it's actually 200 ton. Yeah, it's a 200 ton fuel tank, and we're sending that out to Demise on our, I think I named it, the Albatross 9, because it uses 9 engines on its first and second stages, actually. So that first 5-meter stage there, just ditching that, and now lighting the second stage, which will almost get us up to orbital velocity before we engage our third and final stage, just to circularize our orbit. Yeah, I'm quite proud of this this launch vehicle, actually. It's very powerful, and it's almost 100% reusable. The only reason we're not reusing that third and final stage is because we don't actually have a big enough VAB. Believe it or not, we've used our 255 part limit. So until we actually pay a few million funds to make the VAB bigger, this is the largest launch vehicle that we can actually build. I just didn't have enough parts to be able to put parachutes and a probe core on this third and final stage. Just see there, getting rid of that aerodynamic nose cone because it's just a bit of extra weight now. But yeah, this thing, I think it might be capable of 250 tons because we always have quite a bit of spare fuel left over in this third and final stage. Because this final engine, although it's powerful, it's also very, very efficient, this big 3.75 meter engine. It's a lot more efficient than the clusters of vector engines that we're using, but because the top of the spacecraft is so heavy, you can't use anything else. Vector engines have got such a great thrust to weight ratio, and when you have 9 of them in combination, it makes for a very powerful rocket. Because I like to build my rockets taller and just have bigger stages rather than add boosters on, because reusing multiple boosters is it's a bit of a pain. So it's much easier just to make each stage bigger and bigger. You see here we're now reusing our first stage, this big 5-meter stage with its cluster of 9 engines. It is possibly I don't know if it's overbuilding the rocket to have 9 vector engines on the first and the second stage, but really just no other combination of engines was powerful and efficient enough to actually propel the spacecraft into orbit. But perhaps when we do a bit more rocket research, we might get a set of big 5-meter engines to actually put on the first stage here, because the thrust to weight ratio of the first stage it isn't great, which is why we have all those solid rocket boosters bolted onto the side, because it really does struggle to get off the ground. I think the thrust to weight ratio is like 1.2 or something. Yeah, and you'll see later in the episode it really does kind of struggle if it doesn't have those solid rocket boosters. But we just touch down gently in the ocean, and now we need to reuse this second stage. Now, last episode we didn't manage to reuse this because I forgot to put a probe core on it like an idiot. I put the probe core on the third stage just in my hurry before I launched it. So this time I remembered the probe core, and you see we have our parachutes, we have our air brakes, and we have of course our fuel for our boost back burn. Well, not really a boost back burn. We don't have anywhere near enough fuel for that. Just enough fuel to slow us down so we don't burn up on re-entry. As you see, it just slowing down so we can deploy our parachutes and drift gently to a stop. Some of you have suggested I get the reusability expansion, which adds the massive landing legs that you can put on your rocket stages. I am tempted by that. I am hesitant about adding more mods, but we do so much reusing of stages and the like. I think it might be worth doing. Anyway, as you see here, now we are launching our propulsion module. It's exactly the same as the propulsion module that we stuck onto Odyssey, except instead of a lander can, because of course we aren't having any crew on this, it's just an unmanned resupply vehicle, it does have 2 life support tanks. Now, I think we have more than enough life support on Reclaimer to actually get them home, but you know, it's better to be safe than sorry. I don't want them running out of air on the way back, so yeah. We also of course have 2 giant comms dishes so that we can communicate with the spacecraft in the depths of space. I think what I might do is actually replace the propulsion module that's on Reclaimer at the moment with this one, because if the Kerbals start getting homesick on their journey back, it's going to be a big help to actually have an unmanned part of the spacecraft so that we can continue to bring them home. Even if they can't continue to work, we can bring the spacecraft home and then actually bring them back to solitude and take them back to the surface. If we have a spacecraft which is entirely reliant on the actual Kerbals themselves, and they get homesick like a day before their insertion burn back to solitude orbit, we're going to be more than a little bit stuffed. So I think it might be a good idea to do this. And also it's a more powerful stage as well, so it's just going to make the burns a little bit shorter, and we should have plenty of fuel to bring them home safely. Just see here, just circularizing our 100-kilometer orbit, and just there we go, ascending up to that. Now just doing the final burn, and we are going to get this stage up into a nice circular orbit. Well, not a circular orbit yet. We're in a slightly lower orbit so that we can actually rendezvous with that fuel module. We did have to use some of the fuel from the actual stage itself, but we have just a ridiculous amount of liquid fuel on this massive 200-ton fuel module, so we should be absolutely fine. You see, I cut out most of the rendezvous because you saw pretty much this exact same rendezvous in the last episode. The entire last episode was dedicated to building stuff in orbit, so I'll try and cut most of it out of the episode. So now you might be thinking, Beardy, so you've assembled the propulsion module and you've got the fuel module, why aren't you just heading off straight to demise? What the hell is this that you're launching? This is a second lander, and this lander is called Monument. So essentially, there are 3 biomes on Demise, and we have contracts to visit all 3 of them. Now, we visited the Lava Lakes biome, but we didn't visit the Sweltering Midlands and the Peaks biome on Demise. So I thought, you know what, while we've got a crew out there, why don't we just visit every single biome so we never have to go back ever again? You can see, as I said earlier, without these solid rocket boosters, this rocket does struggle a little bit with that first stage, so we drop it very early. But this is only 110. I say only, but it's a 110-ton lander, which is pretty colossal. But landing on Demise is pretty difficult, as I've explained previously. So we didn't need the solid rocket boosters, and this rocket's overbuilt. So I just took the SRBs off, and then we can just launch it without them. As you see, struggled a little bit, but now we're pushing off into orbit just fine. We do have a 2.5 meter docking adapter attached to the top, because the main lander only has a small docking port, but of course the massive thing we're constructing in orbit has big Clampertron senior docking ports, so we just have a bit of a docking adapter attached on the end there. Now, the reason why this spacecraft is so much larger than Testament, the original lander that we sent on Reclaimer, is because we want to visit both biomes. Beardy, you madman! Yeah, we're not going to be doing a propulsive movement across the surface. What we're going to try and do is land using the descent stage. This is a 2-stage lander. We're going to try and land on the border between the 2 biomes, and then you'll notice there's a cargo bay right near the bottom of the lander, and in there is a rover containing all the scientific equipment that we need. So that rover is going to then travel to the next biome, and then we're going to get all the science from that biome, head back, and then put it all into the top part of the spacecraft, the ascent stage, which will then decouple, and that has just enough delta V to get back up into orbit. So it's all been meticulously calculated. It should be pretty awesome. I'm looking forward to using it, actually. I've never made a lander that massive, landed it on a planet, and actually had a built-in cargo bay for a rover before. So I'm pretty pumped for that. And you see, we're just reusing this first stage. We got 99% of the funds back from that one because we landed it so close to the Space Center, because of course it struggled so much to get us through the first part of the launch. And of course reusing the second stage without any incident as well. So now we have it up in orbit. We're just going to use this third stage. Again, kind of irritating that I don't have enough parts in the VAB to stick just a probe core and some parachutes on this damn thing, but unfortunately no, we just have to decouple it and send it back into the atmosphere to burn up. But hey, it's only one stage out of 3, and with our subsidy, our massive launch subsidy that we get, 100,000 funds for launches above 100 tons, I think it is, and of course all the reusability. Each of these launches only costs, I think, about 150,000 funds, so really we're saving a lot of money, especially considering just that lander alone, that was, I think, about 700,000 funds. So bringing the cost down to 150,000 is certainly making it worthwhile. And all those contracts that we have for exploring the biomes on on Demise are going to more than pay for this resupply spacecraft anyway. So this is, yeah, as I said, it's not really a bad thing that the Demise spacecraft got stuck around Demise, because it means that we can send this massive resupply mission, keep them in orbit for a bit longer, and visit all of the biomes. So that will maybe be happening in the next episode or the episode after. And there you go, I'm just opening the cargo bay, showing off that rover in there. You will notice it has 9 LV909 engines on that lander. Now the reason I went for that is because I needed low profile engines so that those heavy landing legs could actually reach the ground past the engine. But also, you guys know, as we landed on Demise before, it requires a stupid amount of delta V, and to make the lander as light as possible, I wanted to have some really, really efficient vacuum engines. The most efficient vacuum engines we have, with an actual decent thruster-weight ratio, you know, not using nuclear engines, of course, are those LV909s. The only problem is they don't produce a lot of thrust, hence why we made a 3.75 meter bottom to the lander, so 3.75 meter descent stage with 9 LV909s. And even that, during the early part of the burn, won't have enough thrust to land on Demise, but I've calculated the delta V, so it'll have, I think, a thruster-weight ratio of 0.6 when it starts burning, but it should finish up with a thruster-weight of 1.6. So by the time we actually get down to the surface of Demise, we will actually be able to land on it. But it's going to require some pretty precise timing. But this is just to keep the weight of the lander down as much as possible. Because having a 2-stage lander, so it's a whole extra engine, plus the rover and a cargo bay and everything, it adds a lot of weight. So you need to try and make some concessions to keep it down. The previous lander was 70 tons, so this is an extra 40 tons of lander that we're putting on here. But it should certainly pay off. And you see, there we go, we have the spacecraft on track. I should have mentioned, actually, I did actually name the spacecraft Messiah, because of course it's going to be cannibalized and be used to refuel Reclaimer, and of course then the landers, most of that's going to stay on the surface. So it's giving its life for our space program, and it's saving the Reclaimer crew from being stuck in space and starving to death. So I think that's a pretty worthwhile cause and a pretty suitable name. And there it is, the first glimpse the Kerbals have had with their own eyes of their home in thousands of years. We're one day out from our encounter, so let's time warp in and let's get ourselves a ton of science and probably quite a few rewards as well, world firsts and the like. Although we have sent probes here before, of course, it's different sending Kerbals here for the first time. It is a momentous occasion. There we go, entering the sphere of influence. Right about... Please stop slowing. Oh, there we go. It's because I had an alarm, isn't it? Let's close that. There we go. There we are. In space high over the wasteland. There it is, with its beautiful ring system around it, created by the collision between the moon and Minmus, of course, which left the single moon, now Malice, in a relatively low orbit. Right, let's do the crew report first. Requires the Mark II lander can. Oh, because they're not in the Mark II lander can. They're over here. Here we go. Crew report. You feel a strong urge to turn back to solitude. Ooh, ominous. But we are going to continue. Can we get crew reports from here as well? No, we can't. So, you know what? Let's take that. That report. Review report. There we go. And stick that straight in the lab. And then take another one. And take that. Who said this would be a blue marble as seen from space? Yeah, it's certainly not blue anymore, is it? Right, we have taken temperature scans before, but obviously we haven't put them through the lab, and we also haven't recovered them, so we're going to take them. So there we go. Process in the lab. There we go. I would like to grab that again. There we go, and then just hold that. Atmospheric pressure scan. Process in the lab. It should pop up again. There we go. And we'll grab that. Mystery goo observation. Should get an interesting message for this. As you get closer to the ground, the goo turns a violent shade of red and starts attacking the casing. Ooh, clearly it's as worried about being here as we are. We'll grab another one. Should get a different message, see? Yeah, the goo is frozen like a large chunk of ice. Right, gravity scan. Readings match well with theories. You process that in the lab. How much data have we got in the lab now? Quite a bit, but still not full. So, let's try and fill it. There we go. We'll keep that experiment. Analyze magnetosphere. There's no message for that one, but we'll process it in the lab. There we go. Glorious, glorious, glorious. And then, as I said, keep the experiment. And finally, well, not finally, we've got to do the EVA report, but material study. We don't get a special message for that one. That's fine. There we go. Let's grab it again. And keep experiment. And now let's do the one we've all been waiting for. Let's get Katrina Kerman out. Here we go. Out of the command module. Give us an EVA report. You wonder why we're going back to the inner solar system. It's to get science. I'm not entirely sure what science we're really going to get, because we obviously grew up on this planet. But yeah, there's probably some science to be had from returning to our homeworld. Perhaps we could find the old archives in the old ruined Kerbal Space Center, salvage some technology. Perhaps that is where we're planning to get our research and development progress from on this mission. That's actually a really worthwhile target, not just returning home, but actually salvaging stuff from the old space program. That's a pretty good idea. Right, so now what we can do is, since I put an experiment storage unit on this spacecraft, just collect all. And there we go. They are now all in there, which means if we needed to put any of them in the science lab, we could then get one of the scientists out and just boop, without even having to go on a spacewalk really, just dump it into the lab like so. And there we are. We already have a gravity scan, don't we? Oh, hello. These are biome specific, even when you're high. Okay, not even when you're high, even when you're in space high over the. Is what I meant to say.